So the agenda for today is we'll start with some introduction to sanctions, and I'm going to focus on OFAC sanctions. After that, we'll talk about the casino setting and how sanctions work in casinos and what are some of the obligations or how I see them. And then we are going to talk a little bit about the Russia sanctions and the gaming sector, as we can close with some Q&A. But again, feel free to ask me questions during the presentation as well. Um, just to mention that this presentation is prepared on my own, and it's not reflecting my experience with my employer or the views that any of the organizations I work with is is not involved. It's just my personal opinion and knowledge. So just that as a disclaimer. And I guess we can start. So we can start with the introduction to sanctions, because this is a hot topic nowadays. We hear it all the time, but it's good to take a step back and understand what sanctions are.
It's finished na. If I could up on the
Sorry, somebody's not on mute, and if it's not a question. Oh, okay. I think now is better. So what are sanctions? Sanctions are related to travel bans, to asset freezes, to arms embargoes. They're bans on luxury goods, commodities, and also bans on items that can be used for war, missiles, and weapons of mass destruction. Essentially, sanctions are tools of foreign policy that governments nowadays use, and they are the step before entering into a military conflict or a war. Sanctions are political tools, and widely it has been used in the United States, where the Office of OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, maintains the sanctions programs and foreign policy of the United States. But more recently, you see that a lot of other governments and international bodies are using sanctions. The main objective of sanctions is to change the behavior of a bad actor in a certain way. So they're trying to, stop the funds to terrorist financing, and there are programs such as the maintained by the United Nations and OFAC that are against terrorist groups, and there are also programs that are against drugs trafficking and arms smuggling networks. From my side, I have worked mostly with the financial side of sanctions, so you will hear me talk a bit more about the asset freezes portion, while the rest, which is more related to goods and commodities traded or travel bans, are actually just for the border patrol and people working at the borders that have to maintain this travel bans. So this does not come to us that much as financial crime professionals. So we can go further and see what kind of sanctions are there, because this is something that we'll be using throughout the presentation a lot, and not only like you'll be hearing in different settings. So on one hand, sanctions can be comprehensive and targeted. Comprehensive sanctions are prohibiting the commercial activity with regard to an entire country, and they target the government, they target any kinds of businesses that are there. They're very, very, well, for lack of a better word, comprehensive, let's say. And the Treasury and the governments are seeing that this type of sanctions are really, really impactful and have negative impact in general on the overall population that, for example, does not want that government, or it's not complicit in the crimes of that government. So this is why we have much more targeted sanctions, as you probably have heard and seen with Russia. Um, so the targeted sanctions are blocking transactions, goods, and trade with particular businesses, groups, or individuals. So they have very very focused program that intends to hit a certain sector or part of the economy that would cause um, the government to suffer. For example, in Russia, there is a huge target over the oil and gas sector, and in Myanmar, when there was coup in the beginning of the year, um, the the sanctions were involving diamond trading companies, timber, something that brings apologies, something that brings money and sources to the uh, government from that country. And on the other hand, sanctions can be unilateral or multilateral. So unilateral, they are enacted by a single country. So they're rarely supported by others. And multilateral is when a group or block of countries has come together to support the sanctions. And in theory, when the sanctions are multilateral, then they're more effective because the pressure on that government and on that country is much bigger, and they would need more. It would bring to a political change, likely, or some kind of change. Um, just a second, please. So let's talk about sanctioning bodies. On this slide, there are just several examples, but of course, I think these are one of the most impactful um, sanctioning bodies. The first one is the United Nations. So the United Nations sanctions are implemented in most of the countries that are participating. So, for example, sanctions against North Korea are from the United Nations, coming from the United Nations, and they're implemented in many, many, many countries. Another and one of the probably most well-known sanctioning bodies, OFAC, or the U.S. Office of Treasury that imposes economic and financial sanctions. Um, Recently, since Brexit, we have also OFSI, or the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, um, which in the UK is the body that provides sanctions and guidance to the financial institutions and other obliged entities. And of course, the EU, as comprised from multiple countries, also has the ability to uh, dictate the restrictive measures for the Union. Last but not least, of course, we have governments. I know that in Canada, for example, the government recently also has imposed sanctions against Russia. So autonomously, governments can also decide how to sanction countries or different entities and individuals that are um, their subject. Um, as I mentioned, OFAC is one of the most significant players in the sanctions field. So I guess, and there is my core specialty so far. So I guess it would be best if we speak the. I'll focus on OFAC sanctions, but if in the course of the presentation you have any other question about other sanctions, please feel free to let me know. The biggest question is who is required to comply with OFAC requirements and sanctions? So, first of all, these are the US citizens and residents and persons that are located in the US. So, if I am right now in the United States, I will be obliged to follow all the sanctions that OFAC dictates. Persons that are obliged to comply as well are entities. So OFAC, when they say persons, they also mean entities which are incorporated in the United States or any of their foreign branch. So branch means that this is something outside of the, that's outside of the US, but it's subject to US restrictions, as opposed to subsidiary, which is something that an entity that is not entirely linked to the US parent. So the sanctions apply a bit differently there. That's why it's written foreign branches. And any kind of transactions that are processed via the financial system of the United States, these are also subject to sanctions. So even if the correspondent bank in the middle of a transaction that's between different countries in the world, from which nobody is a US person, or in the United States, this has to be reviewed in line with the OFAC requirements. Any questions here? Maybe I should check the chat somehow. No, it seems fine. Cool. So to proceed a little bit more about OFAC sanction programs, as I mentioned, the comprehensive ones, they are very, very broad and block the governments, and they really aim to cut ties with the sanctioned countries. Prohibited transactions are very, very broad. So you cannot do many things unless it's specifically authorized by OFAC or there is some kind of general license. When they provide general license to do activity, just to give you an example, this activity is related to humanitarian aid, to activities of the United Nations, or to personal remittance, so that the ordinary people are not suffering. The comprehensively sanctioned countries are Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Syria, Crimea, and the new DNR and LNR regions of Ukraine. On the other hand, when we talk about targeted sanctions, one of the important things is the SDN list. So SDN stands for Specially Designated National, and this list includes individuals, companies, governments, entities, organizations, vessels, anything that comes to mind. Recently, there were also sanctioned Bitcoin wallets, as far as I know, so that's something that will be included within the list. And when you are on the SDN list, when someone is on the SDN list, this means that all kinds of transactions are forbidden between US persons and this business or individual or anything that's on the list. If you're already banking or having some kind of relationship with that SDN, you should terminate it. That's what it's really serious. I mean, if we take an example that I am tomorrow on the SDN list, I hope not, but for the sake of the example only. So all my accounts with US banks or in US dollars would be frozen, because I will be subject to US sanctions. If I try to make a transfer to Canada and it's in US dollars, so it will pass somewhere through the US financial system, it will be immediately blocked. The SDN list is comprised probably of around 6,000 to 8,000 names. I'm not sure. It's hard to say. I found information on OFAC website that it's about 6,300, but I think that was outdated, especially with the recent designations of Russian entities and individuals. So let's say the numbers is between 6 and 8,000. But we have to remember that OFAC has a 50% rule. So this means that if I own a company and I'm on the SDN list, although this company won't be listed on the list, it will be sanctioned because I'm the owner. So anyone who owns more than 50%, 50 or more percent actually for OFAC, is blocked as well. So This makes the list much, much larger and the situation much more complex. The SDN and the comprehensive sanctions are much more prohibited. There are many prohibitions involved there. But as I mentioned, they're more and more targeted, and there is a targeted approach. So OFAC maintains other sanctions lists that may have different prohibitions. For example, there are sectoral sanctions. This is, oops, I'm sorry. Sectoral sanctions, this is a list when many Russian companies and individuals were added after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. There are also the non-SDN Chinese military industrial complex companies list, and that's something related to the I still cannot pronounce it well. You remember the cotton company in Xinjiang? If somebody can correct me, please feel free. That's related to the Chinese military industrial complex companies, and the sanctions there are not always related to blocking. For example, on the sectoral sanctions list, you have the opportunity to reject the transaction, so to say that you are not going to participate, you're not going to take part, but you notify OFAC that this is what is happening. Yeah, so these are some of the other lists that appear on OFAC's website and that are interesting to note, and to know that not everything means that it has to be blocked. Questions or something? No? Okay, so we can go further. And while we talk about sanctions, it's good to talk about politically exposed persons as well, or PEP. PEP is defined by the Financial Action Task Force as an individual who is or has been entrusted with a prominent public function due to their position and influence. It's recognized that many PEPs are in position that potentially can be abused for the purpose of committing money laundering offenses and related predicate offenses, including corruption and bribery. What are PEPs? So these are some of the government officials, political party officials, senior executives, relatives, or close associates. For non-SDN, is it only US requirement? Well, sorry, that was a question about non-SDNs. Apologies. So for non-SDNs, well, it would depend on the situation, but it's not only a US requirement. Like, you need to think first about, do the sanctions apply? So let's imagine you have a customer that's a non-SDN, but this customer is on some of the other lists. Then you need to take a look who or where is the US nexus. Is it the US dollar transaction? Is it who's on that list, what list, and what is the transaction? So unfortunately, is it only US requirement? It's hard to say, because we will have to have an example with many specifics before answering that. I know it's not a perfect answer, but yes, the non-SDN lists are again related to the same thing as the slide before, this one. To whom it applies? To many, many things. Hope that helps. So to come back to PEPs, and why do we need to talk about politically exposed persons? Well, they are in higher risk of sanctions when it comes to comprehensive sanctions, because maybe somebody won't be on the list exactly just now, but they can be government official from that country. So we need to flag that as high risk. We need to know the risk and understand the risk related to politically exposed persons, because as the FATF says, these are people that we are risking to get illicit funds stemming from corruption and bribery or other money laundering offenses. So, oops, this changed. Apologies. Go back. Yeah. So about the PEPs, it's good to know and rate your risk accordingly, knowing what's happening. If somebody is a PEP, that's not necessarily related to sanctions, but know if this is a politically exposed person who is in the government of Syria. Well, that's a really high risk. Although he's not an SDN, he's part of a comprehensively sanctioned jurisdiction, and you would need to understand better what is happening with that person, what kind of role he has. Can he be subject to any of the Syrian prohibitions? I'm sorry I couldn't go back to the PEP slide. So, as you can see already, the sanctions and casinos are also tied to one another. And although the requirements differ from financial institutions, there are recommendations from OFAC and other bodies that, such as the FATF, that casinos as such in the gaming industry should consider sanctions and can be subject to penalties if they're not doing sanctions compliance properly. According to FinCEN, persons can gamble anonymously in the United States until they have until one of the three below happens. If they open any kind of accounts, that is check cashing, credit deposit, player rating, or slot club account, or if they conduct a reportable currency transaction that exceeds $10,000 in a gaming day. These are related to the cash reporting requirements in the United States. Or they fall under the customer identification requirements deposit for deposit and credit accounts, check with face value of more than $3,000, or domestic wire transfer in excess of 3 million. Yeah, or any international wire transfer. So once you have such interaction that requires the customer to do something like this, you would know more about this customer. So they will no longer be anonymous. And when to check for sanctions. So you can check for sanctions when this customer opened one of the accounts above that I mentioned, or when there was a triggered currency transaction reporting requirement, if there is any federal income tax form filed containing the customer information, or when it was triggered by FinCEN record keeping requirements. So this means that you, as a casino, for example, you don't have to screen only the accounts, but you have some documents that you would like to consider screening in order to comply with sanctions. So this is in relation to when to check, but you probably know that since you're probably working in that field. But what happens when we have a true match? So in this case, you are required to make sure that this is a true match. So if you have the name only, you would need to get the passport number, date of birth, and place of birth, any other identifiers that will help you disqualify or confirm a true match. So for example, if I open an account and I just have my name, you would want to see more, and I'm that same person that's on the SDN list, you would want to see my date of birth, for example, to confirm that it's me, or anything else that OFAC has listed. Because sometimes what happens is that there are not enough details, like date of birth, or there are several dates of birth, alternative, or for example, they don't know the passport number. In these cases, you need to work with what's given. And if the name is on the list, you have to then let them know that you cannot permit them to conduct transactions. Of course, this is in cases when you are a US person and you are obliged, not you personally, but either you're working or your institution is, or the context of the sanctions does not allow this customer to conduct any transactions or further business with the casino or the gaming institution. If you already have an account, or if you have any kind of relationship that requires some kind of financial or non-financial activity with that person, you must make sure that this is blocked and OFAC is notified. So for example, if there is account with $10 on it and that's just inactive, you will have to freeze it, keep these $10 and report them to OFAC. So you make sure that this customer is not coming and, for example, gaming with them or doing something else. It's good to remember that there is no minimum dollar amount for blocking transactions involving individuals and entities on the SDN list. So it can be just a cent, it can be just a document. Okay, I guess document, no, but that just there is no minimum amount. Although for casinos, there is no specific requirement for having an OFAC compliance program, I wanted to share with you the 5 pillars of an efficient OFAC compliance framework, so that if you are the one who's responsible in your organization for conducting sanctions reviews, you can have some of the ideas and best practices that are recommended for having a sound compliance program. The first one comes from the management commitment. Of course, you have to have the adequate resources, and the management should support the compliance personnel um, with this endeavor to be compliant with OFAC sanctions. So resources can refer to technology, to facilities, anything that can be used for effective compliance. The second pillar is risk assessment. So if you are just a local, let's say, casino in uh, Poland, where I am right now, let's say, and I don't do any operations and I have nothing related to the United States, or products that I'm offering to foreigners, then probably my risk assessment for OFAC sanctions would not be very, very robust, or there would be nothing about it. So it's really important to make a risk assessment that reflects the specific clients, products, services, locations, and um, any kinds of risk that your institution is facing, so that to determine what are the applicable risks of sanctions. 3, we have internal controls. So there are policies, procedures, communication related to this, escalation procedure, how it works, and very important, the record keeping, because for OFAC is important, and other US Treasury bodies, it's important to have records for what you have done. 4, we have testing and auditing. Um, Likely you would not do manual checks, but in case that's the case, you need to then make sure you have an appropriate audit so something is not missed and mistake did not happen. And if you have an automated screening system, which is likely the case since there are many, many vendors and solutions on the market, then you need to make sure also that this is being tested and audit is being performed on your compliance, in your compliance program. And last but not least, training. There should be knowledge among the employees, knowledge among the compliance personnel, and communication of the sanctions responsibilities, so everyone is accountable and everyone knows what has to be done. So this is, in short, the framework If you have more questions, or you want to dig more into that, because this is not only for OFAC. You can see similar frameworks being crafted in the Union, in EU, and in general, I think those are some sound advice that would be applicable to many institutions. Before going to Russia, the hot topic here, I want to pause just for a second to see if you have anything else to add, or um, if you would like to understand something more. Okay. So at this time, I didn't receive a message or didn't hear a microphone being unmuted, so we can proceed with the Russian sanctions. Since February 22nd, Russia became the most sanctioned countries in the world. So before that, it was Iran with around 3,000 designations, so 3,000 persons, governments, and entities on the SDN list. But now we have Russia, and you can see that the data shows that just in a couple of months, so this I obtained a week back in June, um, between February until June, there were 8,200 new persons and entities designated under the Russia program. If you're not dealing with sanctions in general, just to know that the word unprecedented after COVID was used about Russia sanctions the most, I guess, because this was really something unprecedented. This is something that's really complex because the sanctions that are being used are really targeted, and they are not comprehensive like with Iran. It's comprehensively sanctioned, so there is very little that can be done. But with Russia, it's different because there is a lot that can be done, but nobody wants to enter also because there are so many financial institutions sanctioned, not only businesses that are dealing with precious metals or metals, let's say, and oil, but so many things. So it's a really complex environment to be in, and I think this number in this graph really depicts it well to say. um so what are some of the trends that I thought of when speaking about casinos and Russia? Well, now, based on all of these designations, we are going to have much more due diligence in relation to Russian clients, either when they're opening online accounts or when they are dealing with the casinos or have some kind of accounts face to face. It's getting much more complicated because you have to assess if they're on the SDN list or they're um, targeted under some kind of other activity there. Um, I read an article also that now with the airspace is closed for Russian airplanes, and in general, this year there will be very little Russian tourists around Europe, and not only. For sure, there will be decline in the visits where traditionally Russians were gambling, so there will be less activity physically in, for example, Cyprus. Um, there will be also potential sanctions, evasion, and restrictions through technology. For sure, people will try, if they would like to gamble, let's say, and this is no longer available for them, they would try to mask their address, and there could be some even evasions using IP technology. Uh, and last but not least, there are several gambling sites that are disassociating themselves with Russia on large scale. So they're stopping services there, they're cutting any kinds of ties, and if they haven't done that, then they are no longer supporting Russian sports events. So yeah, their customers cannot gamble on Russian sports. We know that even the FIFA, have removed Russia from the competition. Um, oh, I'm going to admit someone. Yeah, so these are some of my observations. Do you maybe have something that you observed in relation to Russia that you would like to share? Because since we're not many people, I think now is the best time to have a short discussion maybe and talk about our own observations. Hello.
Yes, hi, it's Ian Messenger here. I just have a question on Russian clients. So, as you say, we are in an environment where, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's a significant increase in sanctions against Russian individuals, Russian nationals, Russian companies. With the gambling that takes place in these offshore jurisdictions like Cyprus, for example, what type of efforts or techniques could some of these Russian nationals use to avoid detection, being identified as being Russians?
I'm guessing one of the things that they would try is use, if possible, dual nationality or use other residency documents to avoid, being detected. This is something that we learned from the Iranians. If you maybe know, in the past, FinCEN discovered that Iranians are using the program in St. Kitts and Nevis to receive St. Kitts passports. So basically, if you pay, let's say, 100,000, I don't remember the precise amount. Apology. So I would say 100,000 US dollars that you are sort of investing in the industry of the island, you can be a citizen of that island. So in order to detect the Iranian passport, Iranians were doing that. I'm expecting that probably in the Russian setting, if there is and there is actually such a over compliance in some cases, like in some cases over compliance, or like being afraid to deal with Russians, I think they would try to do something like that.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if there are some more questions or other trends, maybe somebody willing to share?
Yeah, hi. This is Michelle. I just had a question on the sanctions, right? In what I understand is that the certain regions in Ukraine, which is toward Russia, are sanctions, right? So how does one go about that in terms of assessing the sanction risk?
Yeah, that's really good question, and it's quite difficult. So, Crimea. I will start with Crimea because that's the all that we know. It's more easy for now. If we forget a little bit that invasion that happens. What happened with Crimea is, as a comprehensively sanctioned, people who were in Crimea would be also subject to sanctions. So, I guess from the casino setting, it would be important to limit the IP masking if that's possible. If the IP or VPNs can be changed, that's really really difficult to know. But I know that there is existing technology. What we do in the financial institutions is we focus a lot on the addresses as well. You need to know where this person currently is, and you are trying to obtain information. OFAC knows that there are some difficulties with regard to establishing where persons are, and I can be holding a passport of Bulgaria, but I'm residing in Poland. And since I'm in Poland, I don't have a Polish passport, but you know, um, you have ways to look for a proof of residency, right? Sometimes you can ask about to verify your identity and your proof of living with some address on the bank account, right? Often sites ask me for that. For example, can you show us your rental contract or utility bills that you're paying, things like that. And then you can perform research that shows you where that address is that, it can be as simple as Google Maps. You can input my address, you can put my postcode, and it will show you, well, wait a minute, this is not exactly Poland, let's say this this is Czech Republic or something like that. So why I'm saying that. So I hope that helps. Does that make sense? Or you have other premier concerns?
No, I think that helps, but sometimes, like for example, the cases where, say, a person like whose place of origin would be certain regions in Ukraine, which is sanctioned at the moment, but that person would have migrated to Canada or US or maybe or Australia, right? So and when we look at the profile and we see that the origin is such, right? So would that be a concern, or that should not be, because now that person is, even though it's origin and there could be a time, but his operations and everything is outside the region, right? So in that kind of scenarios, what would be the ideal way to deal with? That is something which is, I think, it's a challenge at the moment. But that's the reason I thought to just ask the group and see if we get anything better out of here.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a fantastic question and a really good concern. I mean, it's really difficult for all of us right now to assess many things, but I think what is best is to consider all the points that you have and all the details, to consult with the regulations. So, what is actually prohibited for these people, what they want to do with your institution, and is that forbidden? Because we need to, no matter what we do, I'm not responding probably in that much casino setting or banking setting. I'm trying to keep it as general as possible. We need to figure out first what applies, to whom it applies, and are we compliant with the regulations, right? So sometimes I also forget, and I start thinking, oh no, this is, let's say, the new sanctions, so probably it's prohibited and something like that. But it's good to think of it this way, always from the top, like um, what's involved, who's the customer, what's the risk, and what's going on, and is it somehow prohibited? If it's prohibited, and you establish that for certain, then obviously you have to either not engage, freeze, block, something. um, what's the next step depending on the product and the type of service. But I think we should always ask ourselves questions before making the final determination. And that's why sanctions are so specific. I can tell you SDN list, but there are so many nuances and what kind of activity can be done even if you are on the SDN list.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Thanks. Is there anything more somebody wants to share or ask? I have this as a summary of the bookmakers and gambling sites that have Russian-related restrictions. So, as I mentioned, there are several that provide no service to Russians. This is their decision, not that it's that much sanctions related. There is no betting on Russian events, and there is no services to Russian-owned sites. And I'm guessing most of these things is the so-called de-risking, or when people are organizations, rather than people, but the organizations are trying not to enter into more complex issues related to compliance. For example, no service to Russians, as on one hand, taking the stance that they don't support what Russia is doing, but on the other hand, they are also avoiding some of the complexities that they may have in terms of compliance. That's what I um, think of it. And yeah, overall, this is my presentation. This is the brief outlook of sanctions. I am sure that probably we can speak 1 more hour only what about what about OFAC, or about the other sanctions that are out there. If you have any more questions that we can address in the remaining 5 minutes, that's all right. If not, you can ping. Oh, oops, there is something on the chat. Yeah, that was Ian. So yeah, for the last 5 minutes, if there are any questions, if no, you can of course reach out on LinkedIn, or if you like to listen to my voice, you can find me on Compliance Time. Yeah, this is my name, Denitsa Rabaine. And yeah, I guess that's it for today.